Welcome everyone from around the US and also around the world. I am Susan Lauer, Administrator of the Maharishi Vastu Office from North America. John Lippman, our National Director for Maharishi Vastu and Chief Vastu Architect, will be discussing our topic for this event. Vastu is not Feng Shui. John will also be elaborating on why only a complete and authentic Vastu can produce reliable benefits. John, would you like to proceed?
You bet. Welcome, everyone. So let's talk for a while about the similarities and the distinctions between Vastu, particularly Maharishi Vastu, and the East Asian system known as Feng Shui. We know that Feng Shui is used by many throughout Eastern Asia and in recent decades also in the West, and that it is a valued part of the heritage of East Asia, valued by many. I can't speak as an authority on Feng Shui, and yet in recent decades, I've had a lot of exposure to it, and so I can offer some thoughts about how it's similar to and how it differs from the ancient system of Vastu or Sthapatya Ved, as it has been revived by His Holiness Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Now, first of all, the title of Maharishi, which is really Maharishi, this is a title which is bestowed upon figures in the Vedic tradition in recognition of the degree to which they see into the laws of nature. That's what the word Rishi means, that one sees deeply into nature, and Maha means great. So this title was bestowed upon him to indicate that he sees deeply into the laws of nature. And this insight of his informs his restoration of the principles of Vastu and is helping us to ensure that they are the most authentic and complete. And I'll elaborate on that. We know Maharishi Mahesh Yogi because he brought out to the world meditation, transcendental meditation, or TM, and he also was one of the primary figures in bringing Hatha Yoga out to the world, yoga asanas, and also Ayurveda, the Vedic healthcare system, in addition to Vedic organic agriculture and also Vedic architecture and city planning, which are all technologies that will relieve the suffering of the people and help them to reach their full potential and live in a way that is truly sustainable. These technologies are associated with the Vedic tradition, but they're really simply nature's own technologies, and they are the birthright of all of humanity and have been revived, particularly out of the Vedic tradition, which is associated with ancient and contemporary times and history. And we see traces of Vastu or Vedic architecture in many parts of the world. Among the principles that have survived throughout the world are giving a precedent for buildings and even communities to face east. This is true even right here where I speak from, next to Maharishi Vedic City in Iowa. The traditional indigenous housing of this part of the United States, the teepee, was erected facing east, and settlements of teepees were erected in semicircles that were open to the east. So that knowledge was even here where I speak. And another Vedic principle found around the world is what we call the Brahmastan, the center point from which wholeness of a structure is established. And we see throughout the world that city plans are organized around a central square, and that many times houses are organized around a central court or a central space. And we can propose, though we certainly have not proven, that the best known trace of Vastu is the East Asian system known as Feng Shui. When we look at the core elements of Feng Shui, we do find principles that are overlapping with the core principles of Vastu. For instance, we find that where you place things, what we call placement, is a key element of Feng Shui, as it is in Vastu. That is, typically where you place particular functions in a house. We find that the principle of orientation, specifically what direction a building should face, is a shared element of both systems. We find that an opinion, a set of information about the influences of surrounding natural elements such as hills and water features and how they influence quality of life are found in both systems. We find that there are systems of astrology associated with both. And finally, the influence of right measurements is found in both systems. So we see some similarity in both paradigms, although the way that the rules are applied typically are quite different. So given that both disciplines are concerned with many overlapping things, even if the rules are different, right orientation of buildings, where to put rooms or placement, measurements, influences of the site, are they historically related? Well, I have asked masters in both lineages this question, and I have been told by masters in both lineages, Feng Shui and Vastu, that the memory is preserved in their lineages that Feng Shui comes from Vastu. This was told to me by a Feng Shui master and by a Vedic architect whose family lineage is many, many centuries old. So, and this seems quite reasonable that Feng Shui may have its origin in Vastu, because we know that Buddhism was also transmitted across the Himalayas from India into China. And we understand that some Chinese brush painting techniques are also thought to have been transferred to India as well. And some have made the case that Oriental martial arts derived originally from martial arts practiced in India. So it seems quite plausible that an architectural system may also have made its journey across the Himalayas from south to north. Now, what might we actually know historically on this subject? Well, sadly, less than we might have, because the man who is known as the first emperor of China, who established the Qin dynasty in 221 BC, wanted to undermine the power of the existing emperors whose dynasty had been in power for between 800 and 1,000 years, and so they were highly venerated, so he couldn't just push them away. So what it is recorded that he did is he built a new capital for them, and it was built according to all of the recorded texts that describe how a building may have nourishing influences to make this capital so attractive to them. And they did move into it, but he built it in a remote location. And once they were in it, he cut them off from communicating with the rest of the people of China. And in that way, he managed to undermine them of their power. Now, having done this, perhaps to ensure that such a trick was not played on any future emperors, he burned all of the books, he burned all of the scrolls. There was a huge catastrophic loss of ancient knowledge in China that happened at this time in the 200s BC. And so it's only by the Sung dynasty, which is from about 620 to 900 AD, long later, maybe roughly 800 years later, that Feng Shui is widely thought to have become much more than just a system for laying out tombs, and to have really become a system for designing homes. And so this resurrection of it is relatively recent. And there are many schools of Feng Shui. It's not a single discipline, but the many schools suggest to us that there was some seed historical knowledge or discipline which may have been transmitted across East Asia. And during the passage of many, many generations, it evolved into different forms in different locations. In my own work, on one of my trips to China in the summer of 2007, a client asked me to design a complex of buildings. He was a venerated natural physician who was trained in Chinese medicine and Ayurveda and Mongolian medicine. He had many clients, and he wanted me to design for him a school to train his followers, lodging, treatment areas with courtyards to grow the herbs that were used in his medicines. And I did this. And when the plan was done, he said to me, now, I have a Feng Shui master. He doesn't speak English and he is not here in this area. So I want to show him the plan. So I'm going to excuse myself for 2 days and show him your drawings. And he did. And when he came back, he said to me, my master says, what you have drawn is completely satisfactory to him, that I should go ahead and build your design. And what this suggests to me is that there may be some ancient systems of Feng Shui that have survived in China that remain with quite a bit of overlap on Vastu, which is very, very interesting. But we find many schools of Feng Shui today, just as we find many differing schools of Vastu. And when the knowledge is based on natural law, it's either right or wrong. Now, what do I mean by being based in natural law? Well, Vastu, or structures that are in harmony with natural law, is derived from one of the limbs of the Vedic literature. Ved, or Veda as it's written, but Ved as we pronounce it according to the Sanskrit practice, means knowledge, but it means total or complete knowledge. It is that intelligence that organizes nature. It is the most primal organizing intelligence at the basis of creation. And it can be described in other perfectly legitimate terms by quantum physics. And so there are different aspects or qualities of Ved, of the primal organizing intelligence, what can be called the constitution of all of the laws of nature of the universe. And one of those 40 qualities or aspects is the aspect of natural law, of the underlying principles that are used to infuse, to organize the structures of nature. Galaxies, solar systems, stars, planets, human physiology, each are structured according to natural law. Each has, therefore, some architecture. And that architecture is a product of Stapatya Ved, that aspect of Vedic intelligence, which is the structuring aspect. And it has been cognized in its totality by enlightened seers in the Vedic tradition. And it therefore is a very precise source of laws of nature. And when you have some accurate source of natural law, then you want to use it very, very precisely. And so there won't be contradictory correct answers in a natural law-based system. Now, when we look at Feng Shui, some schools of Feng Shui say that a southern entrance is the best orientation for an entrance. And yet we know from Maharishi Vastu architecture, and we see clearly validated in the statistical research which I presented in an earlier webinar, that a southern entrance to a building is objectively, statistically associated with a damaging quality of life, with worse mental health, greater heart problems, less prosperity, and greater rates of burglaries. These things have all been measured statistically, and in 3 of those 4 published in peer-reviewed medical journals. So objectively, scientifically, even if we don't have an experimental model that explains why, we know that southern-facing houses are associated with an inferior quality of life. So why might it be that in some schools of Feng Shui, south-facing houses are actually promoted? Well, we can associate this with the effect of the passage of time. With the passage of time, knowledge is lost. And the great blessing of the Vedic tradition is that we have retained the Vedic literature, the ancient texts, so that the touchstone is always there, and that sadly was lost in China. So what are the possible explanations for how in many schools of Feng Shui, the decision was made to favor south entrances? Well, there are three hypotheses that I'm familiar with. One possible explanation is that for much of China's history in the last 1,000 years, its capital has been in Beijing, which is in the north, where it is cold. In fact, the word Beijing means northern capital. And as all of us who live in the northern part of the United States know that in the north, if you have a southern exposure, then you have warmth in the wintertime. And so it would be very logical from that environmental perspective to favor south-facing buildings. Now, a Chinese professor of architecture who teaches Feng Shui at a major university in China told me after he listened to a lecture that I gave on Feng Shui that as he understands Feng Shui historically, it agrees with everything that I said, including the primacy of East, which is associated with the rising sun. But his perspective was why South is also favored, or even more so, is because in northern China, such as the capital of Beijing, it was reasoned that because the sun spends most of its time in the southern sky, then the way to orient a building to the sun would be to face it to the south. So there was just some loss of knowledge leading to an error in logic. And this is just an example of the loss of knowledge over generations, which Maharishi has reversed in our own generation. Now, the last possible explanation that one often encounters is that in this period between about 200 BC and maybe the Sung dynasty, when the knowledge of how to create nourishing influences from buildings was preserved primarily in the construction of tombs. Well, we know from the Vedic literature that actually an auspicious direction for a tomb to be oriented is to the south. And so it could easily be that in China, that people at a later time who cherished their ancestors, a key element of Chinese culture, may have drawn the erroneous conclusion by looking at many south-facing tombs that south-facing structures were ideal for all purposes by their ancestors, and that information should be emulated. Whatever be the historical events, there were many modifications to the ancient and eternal natural law-based principles as this knowledge spread across Asia and as centuries passed. Shall we stop now again for questions?
Sure, John. I have a couple. I think the first one probably is, do the Vedas compare to what in Feng Shui is known as the 9 life areas?
The 9 life areas basically cover all areas of life that want to be enriched. And the Vedic literature offers techniques, knowledge that help us in all areas of life. And certainly, yes, they do offer technologies to help us in each of what in China are called the 9 areas. So yes, in a roundabout way.
Okay, a question has come up. How does Maharishi Vastu architecture deal with northern climates in terms of the orientation and making full utilization of the sun's natural energy at that time of the year?
It's a great question. It's a subject that we are going to devote more time to in either our next or the following, you can tell us, webinar, which will be devoted to how sustainability and Maharishi Vastu are integrated with each other. But what I will say right now, maybe as a teaser, and because that was also a subject that we hoped to talk about in this webinar, but we won't have the time, I will explain that we have in fact designed Maharishi Vastu buildings that have met the highest level of sustainability, that have, for instance, I've done multiple buildings that have been certified as LEED Platinum, and we have done projects to the standard of Living Building Challenge, and we did I did one project that got all but one of the leaves of the Living Building Challenge. And so sustainability and Vastu can be overlaid very well, but to specifically answer the question about which I would call, how can an Eastern-oriented building in the northern climate still take advantage of solar gain from the south? The answer is that the current best expression of this thinking of how to take advantage of solar gain is found in the new system known as Passive House Institute. And passive houses now are practically, as a rule, square. They don't tend to be much elongated on the south side because they have a possibility then of actually overheating. There is an old rule of thumb that many architects, including me, had followed, which define what percentage of your glazing should be on the north, south, east, and west sides. And the largest percentage in a northern climate is on the south side. And what I have found is that even with an east-facing building, even with a building that is elongated so the long sides are facing east and west, it is entirely possible to have that percentage of glass on the south side that is recommended according to the traditional formulas. In fact, I'm giving this talk from my own house. My own house is the most extreme of east-facing buildings in that it is so elongated north-south that every room in this house has an east window. And yet I have very active, effective solar gain from the south. It's a subject that, as I said, I'll get into the details of in a later webinar.
Thank you. That was very good. John, did you want to, someone did have a question that just came in, asking about crystals and fountains and these kinds of elements. Did you want to go into that part of your talk now?
Sure. Why don't I go ahead and an answer to questions such as crystals and some other talismans will come out. And if it's not adequate, then just ask me again. Let us look at what in the West is the dominant school of Feng Shui. It is known, according to its own description, as the Black School. In China, it's common for schools or traditions to be associated with a color, and they are therefore the Black School. They're also known as the Black Hat School, though that's not their own really terminology. But many of us have heard of the Black Hat School of Feng Shui, even if that's not a precise term. According to its own masters, it was largely invented, substantially invented in the 20th century by the founder of the school. And I had some extensive conversations with a master of the Black School of Feng Shui. And he was describing just what Susan has alluded to, that in an existing building, they may recommend that certain talismans be placed in or under the building, some cases a flute or a fan. And I said to him, well, what happens if the occupants of the house don't believe in the effectiveness of these talismans? And he stopped and he looked me in the eye and he said, you have to believe in them. If you don't believe in them, they don't work. Now, raised in the Western scientific tradition, to me, this is a very precise description of a thing that in the West, in science, we call a placebo. And placebos are very powerful, and they are very widely studied in Western science. But placebos operate on the level of psychology, on the level of faith and belief, and are usually almost always temporary. And it is not understood that they operate on the level of real laws of nature, that they would operate on people who are unaware of them or who do not believe in them. And so this is the difference between a faith-based or placebo-based system, which can be powerful in comparison to one which is based in actual laws of nature, that is Feng Shui versus Maharishi Vastu. And so it's our great generation that in this generation, Maharishi carefully evaluated all of the surviving traditions of Vastu in India and examined the texts of all of the books of the Vedic literature that pertain to the subject of Vastu or Sthapatya. And with his ability as a Maharishi, as I defined it earlier, and working with the current generations of the various lineages of Vedic architects across India, he was able to identify which of conflicting practices are really based in the Vedic literature and which therefore are based in natural law and therefore will work whether one believes in them or not. The laws of Sthapatya guide the structuring dynamics of creation that underlie all individual and cosmic values that sustain order in the universe. And it is from that level that we want to derive the rules to create real influences in the structures that we live in. This is not a collection of rules. It is holistic, it is integrated. And this is, interestingly, one reason why Maharishi concluded that Vastu, as he revived it, as he reconstructed it after a 20-year research project that I just described, that it really should be applied only to new construction, because if it's applied in bits and pieces, that is not holistically, to an existing building, then the effects will be partial. And I have seen that partial effects can be very powerful, but they are not holistic. And that is what he wanted to stand for, that if anyone in the world uses any technology that has Maharishi's title on it, that they can know that they are using a system that is fully based in the Ved and therefore will be fully based in natural law and fully effective. Now, there's always great demand for remediations from potential clients, and we could make a lot of money if we offered remediations, but we absolutely do not, because any superficial approach, such as placing talismans, et cetera, in a home or a yard, misleads people because they think that they have a cure now and they have something of very modest effect. If anything, they do not produce the real and long-lasting Vastu Shanti or Vastu peace bestowing effect as defined and determined by Maharishi. Interestingly, the famous American magicians Penn and Teller dedicated a television show to evaluating the contemporary understanding of Feng Shui and to determine whether it is a science. They did a really interesting experiment. They selected one house and they had 5 different masters of Feng Shui visit the house separately and make recommendations for how to improve its influences. And what they displayed in the television show is that each of the 5 made different recommendations from the other 4. And I think that, we may draw a conclusion that this demonstrates a lack of consistency in the professional practice of Feng Shui. And this, of course, also happens in Vastu. There are different schools of Vastu. And what Maharishi did, in addition to putting the Ved back into Vastu, is that he standardized it based on this 20-year research project. And he then set up a training program for consultants for Vedic architects, such that everyone who is able to practice the system known as Maharishi Vastu or Maharishi Sthapatya Ved is practicing exactly the same thing. And more than that, we go through an extensive educational course equivalent to a master's degree. Then we go through an internship, and then we practice permanently with peer review so that we are a second party can make sure we haven't missed anything. And it was not enough for him simply to review the Vedic literature, to go over the practices in all of the traditions across India, and to use his intuition as a Maharishi to determine what was correct. Then he encouraged that scientists and physicians evaluate the conclusions. And so over the past 22, 23 years, there have been a number of good research projects, many results published in peer-reviewed medical journals, that have tested the recommendations of Maharishi Vedic architecture. And this was the subject of the last webinar that I gave. And if this is a subject of particular interest to you and you didn't see it, you can find it and have a look at it. We want much more research to be done, tens, hundreds of more studies. And one of the major medical research institutions in the United States and I want to collaborate together. And we're planning on a meeting in October to set up a research test protocol. And so we hope that over the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, much more objective research will be done on the system. But what has been done so far is really stimulating. It lends quite a bit of confirmation that this system is really based in natural law and is independent of placebos. So I mentioned that even though it was listed as one of the subjects of today's talk, that we wouldn't really have time to go into how Maharishi Vastu architecture complements sustainable building systems, because I feared, as in fact I have done, that I would just talk too long on the subject of Maharishi Vastu and Feng Shui. So I hope that you'll bear with us and listen to that in a separate webinar. And with this, I think we've pretty well covered the subject of the relationship between Vastu, as Maharishi has restored and systematized it, and Feng Shui. And Susan, I'd like to turn it over to you for any questions.
Thank you, John. Just let me see if there are any that I think, one that we brought up on Tuesday evening that I think is worthwhile just mentioning is, does Vastu talk about city and town planning laws?
The answer emphatically is yes. Vastu city planning is a discipline. And I have lived for years in the first city in the modern era in the world that is designed according to Maharishi Vastu city planning, and that is Maharishi Vedic City, Iowa. And the effects are quite profound, and we can understand it through systems in physics in which, when all of the elements of a structure are aligned with each other, then the structure becomes coherent and repels incoherent outside influences. In one case, this is known as the Meissner effect. And in the same way, on the level of a city, when the houses are laid out on a grid, there's a central core, a Brahmastan, the buildings all face the same nourishing directions. They are aligned with each other, and the city then becomes coherent. And I can tell you from my own experience that life is very, very sweet in these cities. And so actually, our aspiration at maharishivastu.org, while we welcome helping individuals and families and individual architects and builders to build individual houses and other buildings using the system of Maharishi Vastu, whether they hire us as their architect, whether they purchase a pre-design from us, or whether they have their own architect and we are their Vastu consultants. While we very happily do that, our aspiration is to work with developers, and we do that also because it is only on the scale of developments of subdivisions of cities that the principles of Maharishi Vedic city planning can be applied, creating the added coherence of a coherent structure. Okay, good. Because this came up in the area of talismans, I just thought that it might be good to mention
that there are certain features, particularly features with regards to the site where Maharishi Vastu house or community is located, dealing with water and auspicious placement of water. That seems to be something that people have been asking about quite a bit, actually.
Water in different compass directions from a prospective house has different influences. We know that the sun rises in the east and the sun is the primary influence of natural law on Earth, and that the surface of the Earth rotates to the east. It's our direction of travel. And so cosmic natural law comes at us from the east. And this is a way of understanding why an eastern orientation of a building towards the rising sun is nourishing. And therefore, we can propose that water to the east, which will reflect that influence of the rising sun onto the house, is probably a good thing. Similarly, because a northern orientation is good, water to the north is also a nourishing thing. So there's some information on water directions.
Okay, that seems to be about all we have from questions, unless someone has one that they'd like to send in. I don't see any more coming in.
All right, I see one question on the Q&As. Hello, I would like to know where fountains should be placed in a room. Well, water, I just described, is nourishing to the north and to the east of a house. And so if we put some water object in a house, then we want it in the northeast of the house.
And again, doing this, I think this just brings up the point of doing some small measure like this in a house where the orientation is unknown, where other factors like dimensioning and such are unknown. We can't ever tell what the results or what the influence will be.
Yeah, this is a good point. I have stated that Vastu is holistic, it's integrated. And when we peel out one element or another and apply it, in some cases we get lovely results, but we just get bits. And in other cases, maybe the influence is so insignificant that it's not noticeable.
Okay, we just had a question come in from a very clear and astute attendee. She says, what about living on the West Coast? How does the position of the ocean affect the home?
We would not recommend living right on the Pacific Ocean in the United States. In Japan or China, it'd be another matter. Having an ocean immediately to your west is something that we do not recommend. But when we evaluate lots, we look at a variety of factors and are able to make recommendations in a given situation for how far away will free us of that influence.
Yes, I was just going to add actually to everybody in general that there are at least 20 different elements that are looked at in a formal site evaluation. Okay, this is prompted now questions. What is true north used and not, why is true north used and not magnetic north?
Because what is most primal to the reality of life on planet Earth, the single most primal thing is that Earth is a sphere, and that sphere rotates on its axis, and it rotates from west to east, and that's why the sun and every other cosmic body pass overhead from east to west. And that axis of rotation passes through the North Pole and the South Pole. Now, if we live in certain locations, magnetic north is identical to true north. But in other locations, for instance, in the Pacific Northwest, they're far apart. They can be 25 degrees apart. So we don't want to be misled by a magnetic compass.
Okay. One gentleman says, Feng Shui suggests water flow to the center of the living room. Vastu is quite different. Can you please explain?
I'm not familiar with this particular recommendation. Yes, what I can say is that we certainly do not make this recommendation in Vastu. As far as why this recommendation exists in some particular school of Feng Shui, I'm not qualified to give an answer to that.
Okay, and the last one that I have here is it true that plants inside a Vastu are not recommended?
That is incorrect. Maharishi recommended that when you look out the windows of a Maharishi Vastu house, you should see the beauty of nature. You should see lush gardens. You should see flowers. And we very much recommend that the beauty of nature fill the yard of a Maharishi Vastu house. And I'm busy working on that in the yard of my own home, and it gives me enormous joy.
I actually think this man meant inside the actual house, John, not just inside the Vastu fence.
That there should not be plants inside of a house?
Right.
This is not a recommendation in our system, no. That is to say, we do not discourage having plants inside of a house.
Good. I have heard that about 2 kilometers from the ocean or a big lake is good enough.
There is a formula in the Vedic literature, this is in the ballpark. It's not exactly it, but that is in the ballpark. Mm-hmm.
And we should also just say that there sometimes are other extenuating circumstances.
Yeah, which is the reason why I'm not eager to give out many formulas, because people will be tempted to use them in isolation. And as you say, they may miss some other important factor. We therefore charge almost nothing to help people to pick out a site so that it will be nourishing. $99 right now. I don't know that we'll do that forever. We will evaluate 2 sites if someone wants to build a Maharishi Vastu house. We want to remove the impediment to us being able to help you to purchase a nourishing lot for a Vastu home.
What are the differences between Maharishi Vastu and the historical text of Vastu? I am aware of a few, but would like to know all the ways in which Maharishi Vastu is different from the historical texts.
Maharishi Vastu is based very precisely on the historical texts. And there are only cases in which there are elements of the historical texts which have very minor effects and require great complications, which are not incorporated.
He gave an example, John, which
okay.
I think you will know how to answer. Even I know how to answer. Maharishi Vastu permits a water feature in the Brahmastan. Historical Vastu texts strictly forbid this.
We also forbid this.
And also another example, he said Maharishi Vastu has a water feature in the northeast corner of the home, but east of the house. Other texts suggest the water feature should be in the northeast corner, but not the north of the house.
There are different descriptions in different texts of the Vedic literature on this point. And Maharishi had to look at them and assess which were most comprehensive.
Okay, let's go to one of the other questions that just came in a little while ago. Is every design developed by a Maharishi Vastu architect peer reviewed?
Oh, yes.
That was, yes, and I will verify, because I'm the one who often organizes that everything that is done is peer reviewed. That means that even the most expensive, the most experienced consultants have their work peer reviewed.
Correct. This is part of the standardization of the system to provide complete consistency that I described near the end of my talk.
Okay, here's another one, interesting one. Lead, passive house, yes, okay. So would Vastu also encompass fit well, living building? And this lady is the senior editor and Chicago-based A&D writer.
Yes, we actually designed a building according to the Living Building Challenge, the Sustainable Living Center that I was the design architect for at Maharishi University of Management. And we were able to get all but one of the petals in the Living Building Challenge. As the questioner will know, the different areas are referred to as petals of a flower. And we were able to get all but one. And the reason we didn't get that one, that had to do with ensuring that the materials used in the building all came from within, I think, 500 miles to reduce the carbon footprint from transportation. And we were given windows that had an R of 11, which those of you who are architects know is phenomenally high. And this goes back 13 years, and it was almost unheard of to get windows that had R11. And we were offered all of the windows for the building with this extraordinarily high level of energy resistance. And so we made a choice. They came from more than 500 miles away, and we decided to accept that gift, and therefore we couldn't get that last petal. Had we not done that, we would have been either the first or the second building to fully comply with the Living Building Challenge. And so there's a partial answer to your question. And I would love to talk to this questioner offline later more about this. Maybe we can continue the dialogue.
Okay, this is, and I wrote to this gentleman just a minute ago. He was asking, and he has asked, if an apartment complex, this is more an orientation question, but I think people will, it comes up quite regularly, this type of question. If an apartment complex is facing east, but the door to my individual apartment is facing south within the complex, does that have any negative significance?
That's not really a significant thing. What really engenders the orientation influence that we have control over an existing building is the side of the building from which we come and go into the building.
Would the Brahmastan of an L-shaped building be the same as though it was square or rectangular?
That's a delicate question, which would necessitate looking at the specific design. I don't think I want to make a general comment in answer to it.
Okay, I think that's taken care of all the questions that have come in. I just wanted to reiterate with a phrase that I think many of you are familiar with. It's not exclusive to Maharishi Vastu. It's used in many, many different contexts. And that is that the whole is always greater than the sum of the parts. And that really sums up why Maharishi Vastu is complete, authentic, and has so much of a nourishing, beneficial effect and influence on the people, and why it is that we steadfastly refuse to rectify or remediate an existing house, because we just want our clients and all the people to have the very best effect and most beneficial effect in their lives. Thank you all for coming. We really enjoyed.
Thank you.